We're less than 100 days away from the 2020 election. President Trump is trailing Joe Biden in the polls as the U.S. grapples with surging coronavirus cases. Ed O'Keefe takes a look at some of the challenges both campaigns face in the months ahead.
With 99 days to go and unable to hold campaign rallies, President Trump spent the weekend golfing and greeting supporters in New Jersey, while former Vice President Joe Biden made virtual appearances at two fundraisers.
We need real leadership now.
New CBS News polling shows the economy, health care, and the pandemic are top concerns for voters. Neither candidate has an advantage on fixing the economy, but the president earns poor marks in the fight against COVID-19. That has become a central part of Biden's message.
Our president wasn't prepared for this pandemic.
Mr. Trump is portraying Biden as a dangerous pick.
Our entire economy and our very way of life are threatened by Biden's plans.
In early August, Biden is poised to announce his vice presidential running mate, who he says will be a woman. Choices include governors, mayors, lawmakers, and former Obama administration officials. Then there's the conventions. Democrats are still planning for a mostly virtual event, though Biden still plans to accept the nomination in Milwaukee. The president last week canceled plans to hold his convention in Jacksonville. Another big concern in the coming weeks? Foreign interference. The nation's top counterintelligence official says he's primarily concerned with China, Russia, and Iran. Finally, there's how you will cast your ballot and how your vote will be counted. Polling locations could be limited with less available poll workers due to COVID concerns, and election officials anticipate historic demand for absentee ballots from voters unwilling or unable to vote in person. Many states warn they're struggling to recruit the manpower needed to quickly count so many paper ballots. And with absentee balloting, there are, of course, deadlines. In some states, it's just a few days before Election Day. In others, it's about 2 weeks out. If you're interested in voting, best to check your local information. Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, Washington.
CBS News campaign reporters Nicole Sganga and Erickson join me now. Nicole is covering the Trump campaign, and has been following Joe Biden's campaign. Always great to see both of you. Nicole, let me start with you. We have seen the president fall in the polls during the pandemic. Put this into context for us. How much of an impact is the administration's response to the crisis having on the president's approval rating?
Well, while some re-election campaigns, particularly incumbent campaigns, have everything to do with how the economy is going, Elaine, this year, 2020 is more and more tied to the coronavirus pandemic and is becoming really a referendum on this administration's handling of the COVID-19 outbreak. And we're starting to see a trend line as more and more disapprove of the president's response to the coronavirus pandemic. His numbers are starting to slip in certain states. According to a recent CBS News Battleground Tracker poll out yesterday, the president just holding on to a 1-point edge in a key state of Ohio. So we're starting to pay attention to those numbers. The president just spoke with reporters in North Carolina this afternoon. I was watching. He was asked about these poll numbers, and he had this to say. He said, quote, "I think the poll numbers we have are very good." He went on to say, when you look at it, the same thing happened 4 years ago. Quote, "I was losing everywhere. I had poll numbers that said I wasn't going to win any state, and I ended up winning every one of them," end quote. That being said, we do hear from the Trump campaign top officials who tell us they're disregarding public polling numbers. That said, we should say that even though 2016 polls might have suggested one thing, in 2018, we did see Democrats retake the House. So certainly it's important to keep an eye on some of the trends happening nationwide. And yes, of course, we know that the coronavirus pandemic will be on the ballot in November.
So, Nicole, are we seeing the Trump campaign shift strategies because of this?
We are starting to see the Trump campaign play around with strategies, starting to take the coronavirus pandemic perhaps more seriously. We saw last week, Elaine, The Trump campaign and Republican National Committee announced that festivities in Jacksonville, Florida, which has seen a surge in the number of coronavirus cases, were canceled following the nomination convention for Republicans of President Donald Trump. We've seen the campaign stop hosting rallies, big, large gatherings in some of these states in recognition of CDC guidelines. We saw the president for the first time in the month of July wear a mask when he was visiting Walter Reed Medical Center. So certainly the president has started to signal, that perhaps he is shifting his focus back to handling the coronavirus pandemic. Officials I speak with in the Republican Party and members of the Trump campaign say that until the coronavirus pandemic is confronted, until the administration wraps its hands around this pandemic, we can't approach other topics like the economy and bringing things back to normal and making America great again, as the Trump campaign has always set out to do.
Well, Bo, how is the Joe Biden campaign addressing the pandemic?
Well, they always wanted to do kind of exactly what President Trump did not want to do from the beginning. They said they were going to take it seriously. They were looking at what the president's hesitation was to wear masks at the beginning. And so that's when you saw Joe Biden in every picture he could wear a mask, even though he may be in his house. He was trying to make a point and needle President Trump and try to project an image to voters that he was taking this pandemic more seriously than President Trump was. He's also been very critical on what President Trump has done, especially with those PPP small business loans. That has been something that keeps coming up on Joe Biden's radar, saying that that money disproportionately went to more wealthy Americans, more wealthy businesses. And then just today, as we look forward to maybe down the line on how to address this pandemic, when on the topic of vaccines, there is apparently some hesitation from the Biden campaign that President Trump will, try to take a lot of credit for the vaccine, even though it may not be fully there yet. So they actually just released 3 principles that they're asking the Trump administration to stick to, and it was essentially to mean that they are going to take the advice of scientists and try not to make it a more political realm. They're trying to get ahead of that.
Well, Bo, what other key issues is the Biden campaign focusing on as Election Day nears?
The economy is the big point right now for Joe Biden. It is the one area, when you look at polling, that a lot of voters give actually the credit to President Trump on, not by wide margins, but a kind of a majority of voters say that they think that President Trump may even do better leading the economy after the pandemic. So in the past couple weeks, Biden has released 3 plans on the economy, on manufacturing, starting a green energy economy, and lastly on 21st century caregiving. And the big element of these plans that ties them all together is jobs. The 3 plans altogether promise around 10 million jobs, which Biden says will allow the country to build back better after the pandemic, get people back to work if they've been laid off or lost their job.
Well, the president has been going after mail-in voting. Nicole, how do we expect this issue to intensify come November?
Well, as election officials from both parties scale up their mail-in voting operations, Elaine, the president and the attorney general, Bill Barr, have made unverified claims repeatedly that foreign actors could tamper with those ballots or there's some sort of voter fraud. But those comments have really baffled election officials and experts who say that there's a complicated and detailed set of safeguards in place expressly designed to detect and prevent this kind of interference. And if you look at Michigan, which is a key battleground state that Mr. Trump won in 2016, this will be the first election in 2020 that there will be no excuse absentee voting. That was a measure that was actually approved in a 2018 ballot measure where 2/3 of voters approved of no excuse absentee voting. And so we're going to see this dynamic play out. We know from a recent Gallup poll that 64% of Americans support vote by mail, but it's also a politically, partisan issue. While 83% of Democrats support the effort, only 40% of Republicans do. And we've continued to see the Republican Party and the Trump campaign pour millions of dollars into lawsuits spanning jamming the entire country, challenging efforts to expand absentee voting, and really playing out to the base. The Trump campaign, the Republican National Committee, and other Republican committees just today filed a motion to intervene in an Iowa election law case. And so we're going to continue to see the Trump campaign and Republican Party really challenge this. It could play out with older voters, Elaine. We know that older voters overwhelmingly approve of mail-in voting. It is the older population that's more vulnerable to the coronavirus pandemic. Older voters I speak with want an opportunity to vote absentee, to have no excuse absentee voting. That's a part of the population we know that President Trump was very popular with in 2016, but recent polling has shown he's starting to lose ground.
We'll continue to watch that. Meantime, Joe Biden has yet to announce a running mate. Bo, what is the latest on that front?
We are definitely in the public relations push now at the very last bit of the vetting process for Joe Biden to find his own Biden. And what our reporting tells us at CBS News is that the vetting of documents, these about 6 to 10 women who are still under consideration, their documents, their political and their personal documents have been vetted through. Now we're waiting to get some indication to see who is going to interview directly with Joe Biden for that big number 2 job. We've been hearing it that it is the most important job interview in the world. And so when we find out when that is going to happen, we think it's going to be sooner rather than later. That will whittle down the numbers for an announcement that is expected sometime in the beginning of August. That date is kind of shifting around a little bit, but the convention is coming up in the middle of August for the Democrats, and that is usually when the ticket is fully formed.
All right. Well, before we let you both go, Notre Dame withdrew from hosting the first presidential debate. Nicole, what more can you tell us about that?
That's right. The University of Notre Dame had withdrawn from hosting the first presidential debate, which was slated to be on September 29th. In a letter to the Notre Dame community, Father John Jenkins, who is the president of the University of Notre Dame, wrote, quote, "In the end, the constraints the coronavirus pandemic put on the event, as understandable and necessary as they are, have led us to withdraw." So in a press release, the Commission on Presidential Debates, which you know very well, Elaine, having moderated a presidential debate, is in control of these debates. They announced today that Case Western Reserve University and Cleveland Clinic will now co-host the first presidential debate in 2 months. That's to be held at the Health Education campus in Cleveland, Ohio, at the end of September. And they said, earlier this year, the commission partnered with Cleveland Clinic on health and security measures. So they're going to do things like make sure folks are socially distanced at that debate to limit the number of, audience members who will get to witness that first presidential matchup between former Vice President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. It's going to feel a little different from, debates that we've had in the past. But as of now, there will still be 3 presidential debates this fall and 1 vice presidential debate.
All right, Nicole Sganga and Bo Erickson, always great to have you both. Thank you very much.